Well, great to finally meet in
We
person,
did it.
Chris.
We did it. Let's go. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, it's one of the longest times that I've probably known someone on the internet and not met them in person.
I keep saying this, like you meet someone in 2020 and you feel like you know them through their content and you consume their content and you're like, I know you, but I don't know you at all. And it's this weird like parasocial relationship. And then you meet in person and magic happens.
Totally. Yeah, it's good to be doing it. For those who don't know, you went to Yale. You ran a podcast yourself, so you've got quite a bit of experience doing this one-to-one, but you're on the other side a little bit more these days. You started writing on Twitter, and that's went extremely well for you and sort of changed your trajectory in many ways. You obviously started at Goldman for your sins, I suspect. And after about a year and a half, you joined a startup called Meow.
Yep,
and,
like the cat.
The cat. What a great name for a startup. And you rose very quickly there to Chief Revenue Officer after sort of 9 months or so. So you've had a very accelerated and sort of diverse trajectory for someone who's so early in your career. I'm curious, when you were starting at Yale, what did you think your early career would look like, and what were your sort of ambitions at that stage?
But yeah, when I started, I literally was one of those people. I grew up in Philly, went to Yale, was like a crazy person with like no plan. And so I was like, all right, I'm a maniac. Let's go run up some hill. That hill happened to be like Goldman Sachs. And it was like, that's a shiny object. Had no idea what that even meant. And so I was like, okay, that sounds challenging. Let's go figure it out. And so I did the classic like recruiting process, did the whole 9 yards, got the job there. And then COVID hit. And I was like, wait, I was reading some Sam Altman essay in 2020 about like a startup. And I was like, wait, 5 people in a room can go build $1 billion company? This sounds amazing. My dad sells insurance, right? So I had no exposure. And that's how I first even figured out what a startup was. But I was just a crazy person with a plan before that.
And from there, after you went to Yale, how did your sort of thinking evolve? Why did you choose to go down the investment banking route?
Yeah, I think like, you know, if you are so I think there's 2 different kind of pieces of advice I can think about. If you're like, you are technical and you want to do tech, you should like become a world-class engineer, because that's how you can add a bunch of value. But if you're non-technical, I think people get caught up in this like chief of staff BS, I call it, or strategy or operations. Like, you don't really add any value at the earliest stages unless you are literally convincing people to give you money, aka sales, or you're good at copywriting or marketing. And so I was like, okay, if I want to do this startup thing, then like I need to figure out the distribution piece. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go write on Twitter. Now, you realize quickly on the internet, it's a very meritocratic place, meaning no one cares about a no-name college kid. I'm like an Amazon landing page, no one to click on, no one to follow me. And so I was like, I need to figure out a way to get distribution. So that's how I, bootstrap my way to kind of build this audience. Was like, I'm going to just cold email a bunch of founders and say, hey, do you want to talk live in front of 200 people? And they were like, I guess so. And then I would like talk live with them in front of 200 people. And so I ended up interviewing like Emmett Shear at Twitch, Michael Seibel at YC, Kevin Ryan at Mongo. And like that kind of got the flywheel spinning on the content side.
I think it's a really interesting point around very talented people who go into consulting, investment banking, law. And Chris Dixon actually has this great essay, the hill climbing analogy, where you're sort of at the top of one mountain, but it turns out that it's a local optimum, and the global optimum is over here. That's like what you want to do long term, potentially in the business world. So many people fall into the trap of seeing, whether it's venture capital or a strategy role or a chief of staff role, sort of in between as that middle bridge, as something which feels a little bit better for the ego. But it turns out that like all of those things are at, if you thought about a Maslow's hierarchy of even a startup, strategy role and chief of staff roles are the self-actualization phase, whereas at the bottom of the pyramid is building product, selling product. And I think it takes a certain self-awareness, but also long-term view to be able to say, actually, I'm willing to quote unquote eat the shit for a couple of years and actually build the skill set that's going to hold me in better stead long term. What were you thinking that actually gave you the confidence to do that, though?
So I think of a few points. I call it like the optionality trap. Yeah. It's like the people that, you get an A on your test in middle school, and then you get into a good college and your parents are proud of you, and then you say, okay, the next thing to get the golden star on my resume is I get a job at McKinsey or Goldman, and then you just keep collecting optionality up until you're 35 years old and didn't have to make any hard decisions to shut down what your options could be. And so for me, it's like, I will now never be a hedge fund manager. I am not, finance adjacent. I'm now building a startup. And so like I've cut off a ton of different paths, and that is scary for people. But what it forces you to realize is like you need to like think very deeply on like what you want to spend the next 20 years on versus like procrastinate your way until you're 35 collecting optionality. So that's kind of like the first piece. The second is like when I think about, okay, what do I want to do the rest of my life? I love this story from Bezos where he's like a junior at Princeton and he's in this quantum physics class. And he's like, okay, it starts at Princeton with 100 people your freshman year. By junior year, there's only 30 left. And him and his roommate are banging their head against the wall trying to solve this problem. 4 hours later, he's like, we can't figure it out. They're like, why don't we ask this guy named Yasanta? So they run to Yasanta's room in Princeton and literally be like, tell him the question. And 3 seconds later, Yasanta says, cosine. And they're like, wait a second, what do you do? He's like, oh yeah, okay. And he starts 3 pages of notes Yasanta writes down, and ultimately everything cancels out to the simplest thing in geometry. And that's when Bezos knew he would never be a physicist. And so I say, like, if you can't become one of the best at what you're doing, quit. And so that's how I felt about finance. I was pretty good. I think I was like above average. I was a decent analyst, but it was like, I need to play a game that I feel like I could become the best at.
Did you have a specific moment where you realized that?
Yeah, I literally so my roommate is one of my best friends. He works at like a private equity investment fund. And he literally when I look at him and like his obsession, and then the other people I worked with at Goldman, one of them starting a hedge fund, it's like their obsession with 10Ks and Qs. Saturdays, they're thinking about like, where did the market change this week and how do I was in but not in love. And so I knew like I would just not be able to compound the focus for 20 years to become one of the best.
It's a rare breed.
Yeah.
Who can read 10K all day. Coming from investment banking myself, I can very safely say that. So when did you realize being a founder was the route that you wanted to take?
Yeah, and I think you probably resonate with this because there's like the creator versus founder that we kind of both lived in. And, I admire people like Sahil Bloom, who's an investor, that's a full-time creator. And I kind of was like, all right, what game do I want to play? And when I thought about doing creator full-time versus kind of trying to build a large company, doing like something venture scale, I was like, what intoxicates me the most is like a few crazy people in a room going after a $10 billion mission. And the type of people and talent you can attract to work with you in the trenches 12, 13, 14 hours a day doing that, I just didn't love content enough to want to give that up. And so for me, I think that's how you think about like bootstrapping versus venture-backed is like, I want to go after something crazy and spend an inordinate amount of time doing this with crazy people that also think similar ways. That's kind of why I focused on that versus I just didn't. It was back to this like, if you can't become the best, quit. I thought I was like, I liked content, but I didn't love it. So that's kind of how I thought about it.
And we'll touch more on what you're working on now. But before that, curious to understand how Twitter changed your life and potentially set you up to go and start the company that you're working on now.
I mean, I'll give you a very tactical example. And so I left Goldman to join a company called Meow. I was the 9th person. We were doing like business banking, fintech. And so like help startups earn more yield on their cash. I came in as an IC salesperson and was able to close $100 million in assets in 100 days. That's not like a brag. What was crazy about that is 70% of that were from people that I DM'd on Twitter or people that like had a small newsletter that they would read. And they were like, oh yeah, I feel like I know and trust you. And you have some credibility that you're not just a guy trying to show me a product. I trust you and I know you. And so I, in a tie, I'll consider giving you the business over someone else. And so like, I was able to like close sales and compress sales cycles so much faster because of that built-in trust. And that example like applies to 100 other different areas, but I think that's probably the most tactical one to think about.
There's something special about having access to someone's DMs after they follow you.
Yeah,
it's a serious unlock.
Twitter DMs are still underrated.
Still underrated
somehow.
Always, yeah. Luckily, the platform is still sort of existing in its current state, so hopefully it stays that way. How has your or the types of people that you spend time with changed since you left Goldman?
Yeah, I like really think a lot about, and I think about it in company building, but also like personally, is like you become the average of the 5 people you surround yourself with. In company building, that's why we don't work in a WeWork. We work in our own office, because if you're surrounded by other companies that work 9 to 5 and cash paychecks and don't really care, that infects your team and your culture. And so that's like a tactical kind of example. On the personal side, like I really believe in this idea of compounding in relationships. I think a lot of people think about it in the money context. It's like if you compound for 7% a year for 50 years, you're going to have a lot of money. Not a lot of people think about it in the relationships context, meaning if I spend an hour with someone, I want to spend 10 years with them. In terms of like those relationships that I have now, I want to compound and build trust for the next 10 or 20 years. And so when I think about the finite time I have outside of work, I'm like, is this person the compounding relationship that I want to spend the next 10 years with? Which is a crazy thing to say at my age, right? And so that's kind of how I think about the frame on the personal side.
Yeah, I think it's another example of long-term thinking, the same long-term thinking that allowed you to see that building a skill set in startups is far more valuable than going and doing a strategy role. How have you, for potentially people that might be a little bit ahead of you in their career, or people that you admire, how have you connected with them? What's been most effective for you there?
Oh my God, I could talk about cold emails forever, but let me give I'll give a few cold email thoughts and then we can go from there. So I think people treat mentorship and cold email wrong. If you go to someone and say, can you be my mentor? Your response rate is going to be 100% no, because you're basically just saying, help me for nothing. And so like, tactically, the best way to get a mentor is literally ask a very specific piece of advice, meaning, hey, we're at X million in ARR. We want to get to 10X. Here's the challenge we have on scaling our sales team. What do you think based on your experience? They give you an answer, and then to be in the top 1%, you actually go do the thing and report back 3 months later. That's insanely rare, because a lot of times people get advice and they have no feedback cycle when you get advice. You have no idea if they took the advice. You have no idea if you were right, if you were wrong, all that kind of stuff. And so I think like that's the one piece. The second of like getting into people's inboxes, I call it like SSS, which is like short, specific, and spacing. And so short, like it should never be longer than 5 lines. Spacing, it should read like a few, a space between like you're reading a tweet. And specific, it should be so obvious that you did a ton of work on their background and very specific in the ask that you are making. Not, will you mentor me? Or I have 200 people that want to hear us speak live. Would you do on this date, this date, this date? So I like frame it that way. And then a little nugget I'll toss for people is lowercase subject line has such a higher open rate.
Yeah, that's sales 101. And as far as, I think on the, a lot of people misunderstand, I think, mentorship and see it as a sort of cure-all for solving their problems, whatever they might be. And frankly, someone who's in a position to want to mentor someone would actually like to see a proof of work before they form a relationship with you. And I remember this in the early days of Twitter, where there's sort of all this advice to connect with people who are have massive follows, try and get them to comment on your posts, etc., etc. What actually happened was I said, I actually just want to do the work first, show that I'm actually doing something here. And then the next thing I knew, I had major creators sort of dropping into my DMs saying, hey, would love to connect. And I think it's a really important piece of advice for people who are getting started, because there's nothing more unattractive than seeing someone drop in your DMs who hasn't done the work, who's asking you to solve their problems without actually thinking about how to solve it themselves.
Yeah, this thread on proof of work I could talk about for a while, which is like, the way I think about it is like, here's the worst case scenario of writing 10 blog posts. No one ever reads them and you get 0 distribution. You're in the same exact place you were before. Great. But here's the huge difference. Just like when I'm hiring an engineer and I see that they have their own personal site with links to projects, it's a 10x positive signal. The same with someone who's non-technical that has 10 blog posts that they've written. I don't even care if they've never gotten any distribution. It's like I've thought about something deeply enough to do what the top 0.1% do, which is actually write something cohesive and thoughtful. That's a huge, whether it be just getting another job. Would you rather hire the person who did like whatever's on the resume, the bare minimum, or the person who has 10 blog posts about why Disney's a cult? Like that's just, it's so obvious, regardless of distribution, which is a whole separate topic.
I love that. Who do you think building an audience is relevant and most helpful to? Because some might make the argument that it's not always completely aligned with the company that you're building, but more and more potentially that's changing. How do you think about that?
So I think Twitter and LinkedIn, or the two places I create content, have changed significantly. I was like thread boy peak 2020, you were too, 2020, 2021, where it's like, you know, you write a thread, you get a lot of views on it, it's great, it converts to followers. Now things have changed substantially. And so my framework for content now is I will not publish it unless I am the only person in the world who can write this. Now, what that means is I have to have some very personal story attached to it, right? If I'm talking about perseverance, it's this, this, and this, right? And like I actually have a tangible example. And so like that helps me think of like escaping competition. So that's like kind of the piece one of like what to create now versus, you know, a saturation of AI tools, summarizing articles, that kind of stuff. That's piece one. On the distribution and content stuff, like to me, people have to have a very long-term mindset on this. You can't be like, I'm going to try to build this following in 6 months. I had 9 months where I had 0 followers on social and no one cared. But I was kind of like, okay, if I continue to persist and I develop one interesting relationship on a weekly or a monthly basis, this is a win. And so it's like this back to this idea of like proof of work, regardless of distribution outcome, is a win. Creating content on the internet, regardless of follower count or distribution, is a win because you create content for one person who could be a future customer. Then it comes down to the last thing I think about is like in terms of like time breakdown of what you're doing. You can't be like, I want to start a company in 3 months. I'm going to start tweeting now for hopeful distribution. I think that makes no sense. You need to be like, this is going to compound over the next 10 years. And if I can time box this for 4 hours on a Sunday, it's worthwhile.
I love that. I was at an event with Sean Puri recently, and he said something which really resonated with me. And I think it is the case for a lot of creators who sort of go through this experience of optimizing for follows over a genuine connection, as you're saying, with your audience, and putting a stake in the ground for what you stand for and creating what is essentially a human API to allow people to find ways to connect with you and create a more authentic relationship. So many people fail at that. I'm curious what you learned from Sean. I know you spent a little bit of time working with him. What was that like? What did he teach you?
Yeah, so there's a fun story. So the quick story is I had like, and this is a proof of work point too. So I had like 200 followers. Sam Parr, one of the co-hosts of My First Million, tweeted out, how did Sean go from 30 to 100,000 followers in 3 months? I reply in 5 minutes. I'm going to figure it out and I'm going to report back. 3 hours later, I'd written a thread deep diving on why he had gone 30 to 100K. An hour after that, he was in my DMs. An hour after that, we were on a call, and then I was hired as like, I like apprenticed intern for him. Nothing big. The biggest lesson for me that I think is applicable is like what excellence looks like. You just have no idea. Like I was writing for 4 months at that time. Looking back was some of the worst content on the internet. It was horrible. The first time I get on a call with him, I had written some piece of content and it was a draft and he took a peek at it to review. Got shredded because I was like, wait, now there is this whole new level of what excellence looks like. And I think like if I apply that to like what is useful about a place like Goldman, you figure out what excellence in execution looks like. What is useful by surrounding yourself with these people that are like 10x better. You kind of figure out what excellence looks like. And so that was the biggest takeaway. And then we can obviously talk about like tactical stuff that he thinks about with like reverse engineering viral motions and all that stuff. But I would say that was the broader point.
Yeah. And on that point, you're now a founder, obviously, which we'll get to in a moment and talk more about what you're doing. But who have you looked to as your role models in the entrepreneurial world, and how have you got a great sense for what excellence looks like there?
I love Frank Slootman. So he was the CEO of Snowflake, not technically a founder, which is cool. He wrote this blog post called Amp It Up, which ended up turning into a book. And the primary takeaway is that a CEO's job is very uncomfortable. You basically need to seek confrontation at all times, which is crazy, right? And you need to have this idea of like constantly pushing the pace on velocity to the point in an organization where it's uncomfortable. Tactically, that means the normal standard response is, can we book a meeting for 2 weeks out on Tuesday for 30 minutes? He's like, can we talk about this later tonight, 6 hours from now? If you think about the compression of timeline from 2 weeks to 2 hours over thousands of people in an organization, compounded over decades, that's how you, like, that's the difference between like velocity and kind of like sluggishness. And so I constantly remind myself, even as a small team that we are, is like, how do I amp up the velocity in the organization and attract people that also think in a similar way? And you'd be surprised you can accomplish things much faster than you'd expect.
What are some practical ways that you're doing that?
Yeah. So, I would say right now I'm recruiting another engineer to join our team. And, I'll DM someone on LinkedIn that looks like they have an interesting profile with like a few lines about, what we're doing and why this could be compelling. They say, hey, this is interesting. The standard response would be, let's book a call next week or whatever. Every single time I respond, are you free right now or tonight? Every single time. I have now booked 10 nightly meetings from that minimum, just from that simple reframe, which compresses our recruiting cycle from 8 weeks to 4 weeks. I apply that to everything, right? And so I kind of think about that's like one tactical example of like, you don't need to be a jerk in a sales process to feel like you're pushing someone. You could be like, hey, are you free at all tonight by chance? Like, you don't need to be pushing someone like in an aggressive, annoying way, but you can say it in a nice way, and I think you can get the same result.
If you could give 2 pieces of advice for someone who is either an early stage founder or in a sales role, what would you tell them?
So get off email ASAP. That's like my favorite one. So I think if you thought about it from like a non-sales lens, business communication happens over email. The problem is there's a lot of noise in email, and a lot of people are getting emails from people trying to sell them stuff. Okay, if you build enough rapport and relationship with the person that you potentially would work with and sell to, they would feel comfortable in a Slack message or a WhatsApp if we're in Australia, or iMessage, or one of these places that is outside standard email communication, which I think gives you a huge advantage to reach someone more. So I think like that's the first piece, is like get off email as soon as possible. The second piece is never, and this is classic sales advice, but it's like never end a call without a clear next call scheduled, period. What I mean by that tactically is like a lot of times people are at the end of a call be like, oh, do you want to we'll schedule a time for a week or 2 out. Instead of doing that and then letting the deal die in email, which is already mistake number 1, trying to schedule something with someone's EA, you could be like, hey, I have my calendar up right now. Probably easier for us to just like knock this out. Are you free Friday at 1? Done. And so I think those kind of 2 pieces, which relates to kind of compressing the velocity, work well together.
Sounds like sales has set you up pretty well to be an early stage founder.
Well, I'm trying. There we go.
Cool. So you recently founded a company. You raised 2.5 mil.
3.5.
3.5. Oh, is that the public number?
Public number. Breaking news.
Well, there you go. 3.5. Heard it here
No.
first. Tell me about the process to choosing what you wanted to work on, and share a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, I think a lot about this idea of founder market fit. And so, we all have skill sets. If you're Nikita Beer, you know how to like go super viral and build consumer social apps. When I thought about like our team, right, it was like have a finance background, have B2B sales experience, be in New York, where I think there's an unfair advantage to selling into private equity, private credit funds, venture funds, hedge funds. And then, my co-founder is a deep back-end engineer where like we're building something with a lot of complexity on the data side. And so it was like, okay, if we orient ourselves in this direction, what would be the most compelling thing that we can work on? Because ultimately when you sign a term sheet from a VC, you are entering the Olympics of business. 0.0006% become $10 billion plus companies. And so what can you do to bend the odds in your favor? So that was kind of the first thing. And then the second kind of thing we thought about was like, I really think B2B SaaS is dead. And so the world used to be in accounting, right? If you think about accounting, it was like pen and paper, Excel, QuickBooks was software to make you 20% more efficient than Excel. No one wants a prettier UI with a 10% improvement on QuickBooks. They'd rather just have the work done for them, which is what AI enables, right? People can just deliver the actual work product of the completed reporting on a quarterly or monthly basis versus sell someone a tool to do something slightly more efficiently. And so I think this idea of like the rise of AI-powered services is really becoming powerful, where like traditionally services heavy businesses can now be replaced with a combination of human plus AI agents, where you can actually like deliver the product better and maybe think about more like software margins. And so yeah, right now we're building what I'll call your venture fund's final operating system, which is like a combination of full service fund administration, but using like the underlying accounting data to build all of these better and different products on top. So like portfolio modeling, which is a separate 100K a year SaaS tool that we've kind of combined. Portfolio management, AI Copilot, where you can query your data and say like, who are my top decile portfolio companies by revenue growth? And so, yeah, that's what we're building.
What's been the most challenging aspect so far?
I would say this is all about pain tolerance. It's literally like, do you want to chew glass, build a multi-entity general ledger from scratch, have 37 different data models with different LP structures of different economic allocation waterfall? Like, the complexity is crazy. And so that's perfectly suited for our team and myself, where we were both working 100 hours a week at Goldman, right? Where it's the pain tolerance and chewing glass aspect is just like another Tuesday. And so I wanted to pick something where I felt like this matched, but it's been fun.
What are some things that you do when you are hiring to ensure that those you hire are on the same page?
Yeah. And I think to this point, like ultimately, like your culture becomes what you tolerate. A lot of people talk about this fancy BS word culture of like, hey, I wrote a set of principles that we align by. Actually, what matters is like if someone's late to a meeting, you call them out and say like, this is what our standard is. That is incredibly uncomfortable. No one likes doing that. But that's like kind of what it becomes. And so when I think about hiring, this is something we definitely want to get better at too. So it's not like I have all the answers. Is really like, okay, is this person a culture fit? Do they want to work 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. remotely? Not a fit. Okay, they want to grind. Second is like, do I feel like they're spiky from a skill set perspective of they have some sort of proof of work, back to what we talked about earlier, and they match from the skill set of like where the current team is. For right now, that might be a full stack engineer that leans back end. If we have a full stack engineer that leans front end. So I think like it's a mishmash of culture fit, them understanding like we're in this to do whatever it takes to win. Does that scare you or excite you? The complexity, and then thinking about kind of proof of work.
Something you've said is that great companies are like cults. Tell me more about that.
Okay, this is like, it's funny. I think this idea of a cult is like some misnomer where people think that's a bad word. The way I think about a cult is like a group of people that have a shared mission about the world that other people don't know about quite yet. You would call Christianity a cult if there wasn't like a billion people that believe this, right? Because they have a belief about this thing called Jesus Christ and all this kind of stuff. And so for me, when I think about like, what do we want to build, is like we are building a cult, a people that believe a secret about the world that no one else knows quite yet. And I tactically think about like, how can we build that among the team? And so one example is like, we eat dinner as a team every day at 5 p.m. Okay, we're not just spending working hours together. We're thinking about this. The second is we don't have remote work and we don't have WeWork because everyone's in the same space. Everyone kind of has the same set of like, this is the space that we go build this company in. And then the last is like, okay, if there's no remote work, there's no WeWork, we eat meals together, we don't have all this kind of stuff. How do I make sure that people feel confident in like where we are going and feel like they have full context at all times. I think transparency is incredibly important, of like, not just this is what we're doing. That's very top down and no one likes that. It's this is why we're doing it. So it's like the mission and why, and kind of how I think about it.
I think it's an interesting point when you think about what religions actually have, and those are shared ideals, shared rituals, shared beliefs. And in that sense, it's very easy to see how that comparison can be made with a great company. I had a friend who had dinner with Brian Johnson recently.
Nice.
And he asked him, to what extent do you think about what you're doing in the sense of a religion? And Brian looked at him and said, oh, I 100% think of it as a religion. People are believing that they're not going to die. People are eating so-and-so meals at a specific cadence. Had all the elements of a religion. It just wasn't termed as that. And it just turns out that when you have all of those components, it is one of the most effective ways of moving a group of people in a specific way towards a common goal. And so it resonates with me a lot. But I think it's a delicate balance to ensure that you're still seeing the individual and managing the individual, and not allowing them to get subsumed in what can feel like, to some, I'm sure, sort of an overwhelming type environment. What are you doing practically to ensure, when you're speaking to someone that you might hire, that they understand very clearly what it's going to be like at the company, and you can sort of filter in or out that person?
Yeah, I think there's like, in any hiring process, like, you're obviously selling them on what you're building and why this is a rocket ship. They're also selling themselves on you. And then the last piece is selling them why they shouldn't join. And so I call it the anti-sell. And so, like, I want to make it explicitly clear exactly what it's like day to day. Hey, we show up at 8:30, 9 a.m. We leave the office around 8:30, 9 p.m. Okay. We work half a day in the office, at least on Sundays. You're going to have off on Saturdays. And so, like, if you want a place that's going to be working, 60 plus hours a week, this is the right fit, because everyone's super excited about, we're ringing gongs. We're listening to like levels at, 8 p.m. People, like, it's so fun. And I think that's what's lost in this like work-life balance debate. I make that explicitly clear. And I've had people, 2 minutes into a call be like, yeah, I want to work remote and I want to work, 9 to 5. And I'm like, perfect. It's better that we know this now, that it's not the right fit. Because ultimately, like, the way I think about it is, we're building like a professional sports team or the Navy SEALs or something like that. We don't need 1,000 people. We need the right group of hungry individuals that work together like a killer team to figure it out. And so I'd rather filter out people prematurely.
What misconceptions do you feel Gen Z have about what it takes to succeed or be fulfilled in life?
Yeah, I think there's this concept of, everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too. So like, classic Gen Z is like, you see those TikTok videos of like, oh my God, I'm working, 4 hours a day and this is the most amazing life and I'm getting paid XYZ dollars. Ultimately, the buck needs to stop somewhere. And so I do not think I am talented enough. I'm not arrogant enough to think I'm talented enough that I could work like 20 hours a week and ultimately be successful. And so if you want to have some sort of career success, and some people don't really care, they'd rather be like, I measure myself by the type of friend I am, not by the type of career I have, which is totally fine. But if you want to have some sort of career success, you need to outwork people, because I don't think I am talented enough that I can work less and win more. And so that's kind of the frame that I think about, of like, ultimately you need to make trade-offs. And so the trade-off you need to decide on is like, how important is this to you?
How have you ensured that you sort of burn the boats on that? Because I find a lot of people our age will, in their minds, they think they're committed to something, but in their behaviors, in their actions, it actually doesn't show up fully. They might still be prioritizing hobbies or time on the weekend with friends. How have you practically done that for yourself?
Yeah. I think, when I decided to take money from outside investors, I knew I was signing a contract of like, this is what the expectation outcome is. And my job is to do whatever it takes to win. And so I feel a debt to anyone who's given me money, anyone who decides to join our company, that my job is literally do whatever it takes to win, to make everyone happy and successful in the future. And so I think maybe people don't typically feel that way because there's like a lot of people raise seed money and that's kind of how it works. Is like I feel that there is a lot of people that raise seed money and then there's a few amount of companies that are large. And I really do feel this debt to people to be like, I decided to do this. Like it's my job to make this work. And so that's kind of what gets me of like, this is just what I signed up for. If I didn't want to do this, if I wanted to work less and kind of hang out more and do less, it'd be like, don't take outside capital. Just bootstrap your own thing and hang out, which I think is totally fine too. I don't think there's like one way to win. It's just like once you've chosen this way, now you're married to it.
It's the most powerful forcing function you can imagine.
Yep.
And all human behavior whittles down to incentives. And there's the carrot and there's the stick of losing people's money. And so very hard to not feel extremely motivated in that scenario. How do you consume information today? How do you, if you've got a challenge in front of you, a problem you want to solve, how do you go about solving that as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I think, so there's a few buckets. So like on like the content writing related stuff, I actually built this Claude artifact. If you guys aren't familiar with this, there's basically like you can upload in Sonnet 3.5, which I think is like the best new model from Anthropic. You can basically upload a bunch of context to the AI model saying like, you are a world-class headline writer. Here are 10 articles written by people we know like Nicholas Cole and Dickie Bush or whatever about writing great headlines. And then I will feed them a fully written, short blog post and be like, write me 10 different headlines based on this underlying context. And so I kind of like take of like curation of like what does great headline writing look like, existing context, some prompting. And then like that's helped me be able to kind of create content. So that's like one bucket I think about. I do that in a lot of things. Like if I need to learn more about fund accounting or kind of the specific things we're building, I do similar types of like mechanisms. General information diet, it's like I use Stoop Inbox, if you're familiar with that.
No,
it's basically like a separate inbox that's like it's like an app on your phone plus like or like a web app. Yeah, where you basically like it sends every newsletter you're subscribed to and organizes it and whatever. So I don't like pollute my regular inbox with the 50 newsletters I'm subscribed to. And so I'll go and I'll look through that, click through that and see kind of what's interesting there. And then I'll take that and I'll take what I find the most interesting and I'll put it in this content ideas doc that I have, which is like, Adam and Sachin talked about this, this, and this. Great. That reminds me of this experience that I had. Toss it in the doc. And so I kind of have this like top of funnel curation mechanism. And then I'm using a lot of these like Claude artifacts to help like actual tactical get stuff done.
When it comes to blocking out distractions, what are some of the practical things you do? And one of the things that you've touched on before in some of your writing is this idea of playing founder. What does that mean and how can people avoid falling into that trap?
Yeah, I could talk about the playing founder. So there's this idea of like playing house, whereas like you're a kid and you're like, I want to be a grown-up adult. I'm going to get a toy house and I'm going to like cook fake meals and like play with dolls like we have children or a dog or something like that. And you're like 10 years old.
Favorite pastime.
Classic. Yeah. I think there's this concept of this in building a startup now too. I think The Social Network comes out in 2010. Everyone's like, it's super cool to be a founder now. And I want to be like Mark Zuckerberg and drop out of Harvard. What that created is really ultimately our job in a startup is to build a product people want and get distribution for that and build a compounding, enduring business, period. So instead of thinking about that, it became how much money have you raised? How many employees do you have? What type of press outlets have covered you? Like all of the things that don't matter ultimately became this thing to strive for and get covered in TechCrunch and whatever. And so I think that became like playing founder versus really talking to customers and building a product that they want and obsessing over that experience over, hey, I'm going to like try to get featured in Bloomberg.
One of the diseases of our times, I would say, and alongside that is a lack of patience or a need for instant gratification and not being willing to do the work that is actually required. How do you balance this relationship between ambition, resilience, and patience as you are on your founder journey now? Jensen Huang had a great quote about ambition and the flip side of ambition being that at times that can lead to a lack of resilience or a lack of patience because you expect things too quickly. How do you balance ambition and a want to have things as quickly as possible with the reality of the long journey that is building a great company?
Yeah, I talk about this dichotomy of like short-term impatience, long-term patience. And so like kind of like we talked about earlier, this idea of like velocity in the day-to-day, in the minute-to-minute, in the hour-to-hour is insanely important. But then also being like zooming out of like every once in a while, I'll be like, guys, the past 100 days, we shipped an insane amount. Entire companies that spend years, we shipped in 3+ months in 100 days. And so zooming out and being like, look how far we've come helps build this like grounded foundation of long-term patience. And so that's kind of what I always am fighting and battling with. It's like really impatient today, patient and zooming out and thinking about kind of the long term is how I handle it.
I love this dichotomy. And one of the things that made me think about is this other dichotomy of hard work versus high leverage thinking. And very often hard work or a want to just be doing the thing can prevent us from stepping back, actually analyzing the full field of play, seeing what the highest leverage moves are that we could be taking that could lead to long-term success that might not be the short-term thing that will give us the short-term results. Is there anything you do now as a CEO, as a founder, to ensure that you're doing that consistently and therefore ensuring that over the long term, you're well placed to win?
Yeah, I think about it as like hard work earns the right to think high leverage. And so like Mr. Beast has this great idea of like, you ask him, how do I make a better video? And he says, go make 100 videos and then come back to me after. People, you don't even know, like you're in a dark room almost when you do something, when you're starting something and figuring out what a space is like. You're in a dark room. There's no lights on. You're like grabbing around on the ground being like, where am I? And then you like turn a small light on that lights up 20% of the room. To me, the hard work compresses the time to light up the room. So if you work 40 hours a week for 6 months, or you work 80 hours a week for 6 months, you are double ahead than you were. And so you're lighting up the room much faster, which enables you to have like this zoomed out high leverage view. And so that's kind of how I think about it, and like how the balance between like grinding to figure out and light up the room to like then having the ability to make the high leverage decisions. That's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I like that dichotomy. And I think there are also important questions that we can ask here, a la how could we as a company achieve our 10-year goals in 6 months? How could we 10x our customers in 3 months? These types of questions aren't ones that we necessarily answer very quickly, but the sheer exercise of going through the thinking leads to, I think, a muscle, which is just more divergent thinking. Something tangentially related is this idea of agency, or finding the highest, most expedient action that you can take and going and doing it. One of the things you've spoken about is getting on planes to go and see customers. Tell me about that, and tell me about what other, we've already touched on a few, whether it be asking people to jump on a call immediately. What are some of the other high agency things that you've done in your journey so far of building Hanover?
Yeah, so I call it like always get on the plane. And I think like if you want it badly enough, this becomes obvious. But I think like an example of this is, some venture fund in Utah, one of the people there DM'd me and was like, hey, do you want to get on a call and chat? I was like, sure, this is great. This could be a potential future customer. And so I talked to him and he's like, yeah, I'll connect you to, our finance team about, what you guys are building. And so, it's a 5-on-1 call. I'm like talking about what we're going to ship and what we're building, kind of the vision and all this stuff. And they were like, okay, this is pretty interesting. And so I sent him an email after and I was like, guys, even if you aren't a customer now, or you won't become one in the next 1 week, 2 weeks, 5 weeks, I'm in this for 20 years. I'm going to book a flight right now, whenever you'll have me, to meet you guys in person in Utah. They were like, this is crazy, but sure, I'll spend 30 minutes of my time when you fly across the country. And so I booked that and I ended up meeting, 4 or 5 different funds while I was there in Utah, in Salt Lake City. And I was just like, to me, it's like whatever you can do to get in front of someone in person, face to face, always provides an advantage. And so I did the same thing thinking about like our fundraise and that kind of stuff. And so I'm always like, what can we do to get away from, it's just like get out of your email inbox into text, get out of a Zoom call into in person.
There's a reason that some of the most successful people in the world have private jets, and that is usually to go and see people in person. 70% of communication, non-verbal. There's no surprise. I think that you can build such deeper relationships doing that. So I like it a lot. Tell me more about Hanover. How's it going so far? What are sort of the next milestones in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, so we've signed $1 billion in assets under administration so far. We're super focused on obsessing over venture funds specifically, typically 100 million plus in AUM. And our objective is, now we've built this multi-entity general ledger, which if you're watching this, that's a lot of jargon to me, and like transactions turned into accounting language. We built the foundation. The way I think about it is like Rippling has a foundation of employee data, and then they can build HR, payroll. They can build IT device management. They can build spend management, all these kind of things. And so build the foundation. I call it the bedrock with our team. And then what can we build on top that is better and different than any of the legacy fund admins? And so maybe it's a co-pilot that generates graphs on the fly of your largest LPs by capital balance over time, overlaid with S&P 500 returns. And so for me, it's like obsessing over improving the foundation and a lot of the accounting workflows with what are the better and different products that we can unlock on top. And then just obsessing over the customer and just like, I call it watching film, which we could get to as well.
Tell me about watching film.
So I think there's this idea. So I did this at Meow. It'd be like every night I would go onto Datadog and I would literally watch user replays of them clicking through the web app and like some of their different behaviors. You'd be blown away how counterintuitive your UX is and horrible it is when you see someone who hasn't built the thing be like, this is really confusing and I have no idea what's going on. And so I would watch film every night for like an hour, basically, when I was at my apartment being like, what's happening that's counterintuitive here? What's not working? And that kind of like built this muscle of like, okay, thinking about the user, thinking about, we're not so in the weeds. We've never seen this thing before. What would that look like? And so I think a lot about applying that now to what we're building of like, we want to build the 10X experience for the GP, the head of finance, and the LP.
You mentioned Rippling before. I know you've got some thoughts on compound startups and referred to it a little bit there. Tell me more about that and what you're hoping to achieve.
Yeah, so the idea of a compound startup is that basically the old way of building a company was what you call like a point solution SaaS tool. And so that means you have a very narrow and specific use case and you build one product and you ship that product to solve that very specific problem. Now, that was from 2000 to 2020. 20 years of people building point solution SaaS means those markets are incredibly saturated. Parker talks about is that like, okay, in this like beyond the point solution SaaS, if you take this underlying data, this system of record, so for them it's employee data, for Salesforce it would be customer data or HubSpot, you can then build all of these products simultaneously that have common UX patterns, bundled pricing so it's easier to cross-sell, deeper like integrations on the reporting side because you have the same underlying system of record that's pulling through to everything. The downside is it's really hard to build a lot of products in parallel. And so the way we think about it for what we're doing in Hanover is like traditional fund administration is like incredibly opaque in what your responsibilities end and where they begin, and the product surface area is very wide. And so just to get to the table of we can serve your fund GP entity management company and any parallel funds or SPVs, the build to get there required us going in this compound startup approach. Just the table stakes before we get to the stuff of why you should switch. And so think a lot about that, but I think like the dividends pay off kind of building the like fully integrated based on the system of record from scratch.
And it's resonating so far.
It's resonating so far.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was at a conference recently in Canada, and there are a few themes in that conference. One was around storytelling, the power of storytelling. One was around building an audience and the power of building an audience. Another was being a host for events and the leverage that that can bring in building new relationships. And all of these had the common tie of being underpriced things in society. I'm curious, in your career so far or in what you're thinking about now, what do you think is underpriced that people should pay more attention to, spend more time learning or thinking about?
I think manifestos are so underpriced.
Ooh.
And so if you look at the OG, our boy Elon Musk writes a manifesto in 2006 talking about how Tesla was going to take over the world and his 4-step master plan. That's actually gone off the Tesla blog right now, but so you can Google it and figure it out. But that call your shot Babe Ruth style of this is what we're doing and here's the 4-step master plan to execute on that is insanely underpriced. Another great example you guys can check out is once.com by the guys that built Basecamp. He writes an open letter to the internet saying, you know, the death of the church of recurring revenue, he calls it, and having only buying a product one time forever and owning it in software is super like contrarian. So when we started this company, I wrote a manifesto. You can see it on our site, hanover.co, if you go like click a manifesto at the top. I think it's insanely underpriced that like we have a very specific point of view. We are anti the legacy fund admins as a class. We are for this idea of like you now have 800 times more competition in venture. In 1980 you had 40 funds, now you have, or you had 80 funds, now you have 40,000. And so it's like, okay, I have a very specific point of view, and this manifesto is like a rallying cry about why we believe this is the right point of view. And I think people don't write them enough. I think every company should have a manifesto.
It's interesting how that can also become almost the head of the cult in some ways. And it all sort of feeds down from there. If you think about a religion, if you think about what Brian Johnson has done as another sort of analogy, very similar as far as what he believes. And I think all great brands have in common that they have a very specific point of view. They're willing to be polarizing and piss people off, frankly, with what they're doing. And I see a lot of that in the manifesto idea. So I love that. Curious what you are most grateful for so far, whether it be an experience, a person, a book you read in your life today.
Yeah, I think my family has definitely been like a bedrock. And I think like I don't, like growing up, basically my parents had this philosophy of like set a goal so big it'll blow your mind. And that like forced me to be like, what is possible? There's some glass up there that I'm going to shatter on your way to what's actually possible. And I think that like reframed in my brain. It was like rewiring my hardware. This is what's possible. Whatever you think's possible, 10x that. So I think like that plus like, you know, having them to be a constant like sparring partner for how I'm thinking about life decisions and that kind of stuff and being there regardless of if we're winning or we're losing. Because it's not always up and to the right. Everyone likes to talk about the momentum and the winning, and great, we're winning now. But I'm sure there's going to be tough stuff that happens. And so I think it's like having a bedrock foundation of like people that you can lean on regardless that also push you to like think 10x bigger. Grateful for that.
What do you fear most?
I'm constantly paranoid. I would actually say this. So I'm
Really?
like, yeah, you might be surprised. If you watch this, you can tell. So I'm crazy paranoid, just like constantly around like, okay, have we thought about every single edge case for onboarding this customer? Have we thought about the surface area at which our product should be? Have we thought about architecting? It's almost like in engineer speak, I'm not an engineer, is like engineers think about edge cases when they build a product. How do we architect this to cover edge cases? I kind of apply that to company building of like, where are we exposed right now in a thing that like I should be preemptively attacking to de-risk this? And so I'm like constantly thinking about that on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, which I think is like a healthy sense of like every builder is thinking like this. I don't know if I'm the exception.
Totally. I think it's a common thread, but some do it better than others. And I think there's a very real difference between knowing that you should be doing that and actually doing it on a day-to-day basis, which separates a lot of great founders. Where can people check you out a little bit more, Matt?
Yeah, you can at Chris Halad on Twitter, HLAD, and then Hanover.co. Pretty simple.
Awesome. Looking forward to seeing where you are in 5 or 10 years' time, mate.
There we go. Great. Thanks for having me, man.
Great for chatting.
Cool.